said, I don't see a military solution to this conflict, but we have to put all efforts into bringing about a diplomatic solution.
Welcome back. We're talking about the crisis in Ukraine and the latest talks to end the conflict. Joining us here in Washington is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Popadyuk. With us from New York is the Ukrainian activist and attorney Ivana Belyach. Here in the studio with us as well is the German political correspondent Ansgar Graf. And in London, we're joined by the Russian political analyst Alexander Nekrasov. Ivana, I said I would come back to you, and you want to respond to what Alexander was saying.
Thank you, Anand. A couple of points. First of all, not only the United States is considering and taking seriously this issue, but also Canada and the United Kingdom, they are considering heavily to help Ukrainian army so Ukraine will be able to defend itself. And don't forget that the United States and the United Kingdom are signatories to the Budapest Memorandum, when in 1994 Ukraine was the third largest nuclear weapon country, gave up its weapons. So today, David Cameron, he said that we shouldn't reward aggression with appeasement. And that's one thing. And also in 1991, when Ukraine became independent, more than 90% of people voted for Ukraine to be independent. And we didn't have separatists before, until Russia actually started meddling with Ukrainian affairs. I'm not sure we are defining correctly the separatists. They are clearly financed and supported by Russia, and and also.
Ansgar, when we look at these punitive measures that are being considered against Russia, I mean, we can understand why the Europeans are a little bit more wary, aren't they? Because they would, I guess, be affected more if Russia retaliates than the United States.
They would be affected more, and they are also affected more by the sanctions, which are still in place. Nevertheless, the statement of Alexander reminded me of the rearmament debate in the early 80s. There was also said, if the Soviet Union started with its SS-20 missiles, and then the Russians said, or the Soviet Union said, if the United States would react and would bring Pershings and cruise missiles to Europe, then it's not a danger for the United States, but it's a big danger for Europe. In the end, we have seen it was the best solution for Europe, and therefore I was not very impressed back then, and I think also today, in opposite to my Chancellor Merkel, I think. I'm the only one, I think, here who stays to be a little bit optimistic. I think there could be a solution, but nevertheless, from time to time, you have to arm your hope. And therefore, if there will be weapons, defensive weapons delivered to Ukraine, I could imagine that there will be a solution, a diplomatic solution in the end.
Ambassador, when we look at the seeds of this conflict, it goes back in some way to that EU-Ukraine association agreement that was going to be signed. The previous Ukrainian government said no, they don't want to sign it. The new government signed it. And also to the fact that the Russians felt that NATO was trying to recruit Ukraine into its membership. Did the United States and its allies miscalculate the sort of response that Russia would have if there was talk of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO?
Well, in your question, there's an assumption that policy is based on what Russia wants or doesn't want. Policy is based on the needs of each individual country. Ukraine, on its own, made the decision that it wanted to move toward the West, both in terms of a relationship with NATO, including NATO membership, as well as joining the EU. And that's a right that a sovereign country has a right to do. What you have in this situation is a country has made a decision, and another country, Russia, has tried to veto that decision. And that's where the problem has arisen. And not from Ukraine's desire to talk with the West and move toward the West, but actually by Russia's attempts to try to block that process.
Alexander, you want to respond to that Ukraine is a sovereign country? It can make its own decisions. It can decide whether it wants to join NATO or join the EU in whatever form.
Well, the problem is that this whole crisis was started after the coup in February in Ukraine, and when a legitimate regime was overthrown. Now, everybody always seems to forget that. We have a strange situation when Western commentators and politicians are saying that the crisis in the East and the Crimea going back to Russia, started as if Russia started this whole problem. No, it didn't. If we didn't have that coup, which overthrew the government of the President Yanukovych, we would not have a Crimea holding a referendum. We would not have the civil war, and it's a civil war. And that's what, Ukrainian officials are, terrified to mention. This is a civil war. This is an uprising. It's an uprising against an illegal regime in Kiev, which came to power illegally. So please, don't start saying that Russia interfered into Ukrainian affairs. Russia actually offered Ukraine $15 billion, gave 3 of them already. Russia lowered the prices on gas. Russia was helping Ukraine, giving it economic support. What did the West give Russia when the West took over? Nothing. Sorry,
okay.
Ukraine. It did nothing. It promised Ukraine a lot of money. It gave nothing. It is now presiding over a total collapse of the economy. We have a civil war, which is for some reason, the blame is for this civil war is put at the doorstep of Russia.
All right,
and
Alexander.
Russia is told to provide everything for the Ukraine.
Okay, I want to get the views of Ivana that I know she wants to tell us. She wants to respond.
Well, definitely. I mean, definitely there is no civil war, and I don't know what facts Alexander is talking about and where he's looking. Ukraine didn't have separatist movement until Russia started interfering in Ukrainian affairs. If you look at the polls, 80%, if not more, people oppose Russian aggression. And this is basically the $15 billion help and economic assistance is just a joke. We know that the former President Yanukovych escaped to Russia. Russia refuses to extradite Yanukovych back to Ukraine so he can stand a trial for massive killings of people. And the international community still has to define whether it was a genocide or a crime against humanity, rather. And we know that if Russia didn't have anything to do, why did Russian generals and Russian citizens found themselves in Ukrainian army, in Ukrainian secret services? What exactly is Viktor Medvedchuk, the close ally and friend of Putin, doing at those Minsk talks? And this is basically pathetic. I mean, Russia has lots to do with that.
Thanks, Ivana. Ansgar, we heard some alarming words from Petro Poroshenko just as these talks began. He was saying that if there is no de-escalation, if there isn't a ceasefire, this conflict could spin out of control. Could it engulf other countries in the region, perhaps parts of Western Europe as well?
It could enlarge.
Well,
it could enlarge.
don't forget that
Sorry, Ivana, one moment. I'll come to you in a moment.
But it could enlarge in both ways. Even if the West would stay idle, would do nothing, then the next steps of Russia could be against the Baltic states. It could even earlier be against Georgia, against Moldavia, and therefore I think, sure, it's an unstable situation. It could spread. It could create a lot of mess in whole Europe, and therefore we have to find a solution. But to say, like Alexander did, Russia only tried to help the Ukraine, and then the Western countries started this fuss and this trouble. He knows that this isn't right, and we know that this isn't right. Russia is sending so-called volunteers who are not going really by their own will to Ukraine and are fighting. Russia is sending arms and ammunition to the Ukrainian separatist forces, and therefore there must be a reaction if the negotiations shouldn't become a success.
Okay, Ambassador, the other point that Alexander Nekrasov did make was that this crisis started when a legitimate government was overthrown.
Well, I'd like to correct some of the misimpressions that Alexander has. There was a legitimately elected government under Yanukovych, but in that February agreement, what happened was there was an agreement in terms of how to move forward among the parties, but Yanukovych fled the country, leaving a power vacuum. So there was no coup. It was a democratic revolution, and Yanukovych left the country, fled the country, actually, and so left a power vacuum. And so I think that needs to be pointed out, that there was no coup at all in that sense. And so the democratic revolution that took place at that time started moving forward. And what happened was that this came into conflict with what Russia perceived to be its interest in Ukraine, or how it wanted to shape Ukraine's policy into the future. And I'd like to point out another thing. You know, Alexander spoke about a civil war. About 70% of the people in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, where the conflict is ongoing now, wanted to maintain presence in Ukraine. They wanted to be part of Ukraine. It was until the Russians started infiltrating their forces into that part of the world, of the country, that the place became destabilized. And I'll point out historically, Ukraine has always had problems in terms of dealing with these issues. If you go back to the early 1990s in Crimea, there was a movement by a lot of Russian nationalists to separate Sevastopol, to separate Crimea. But the Ukrainians were always able to solve their problems internally by themselves. Without violence, they were able to solve them peacefully. It was not until the outside forces started getting involved that Crimea boiled over and eastern Ukraine has boiled over.
I would love to get Alexander Nekrasov to respond to that, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us.